this is July the 19th, 2012. We're at the Mandarin Museum at Walter Jones Park. I am Sandy Arpen on the board of directors at the museum with Susan Ford, also a board member, and our guest and person that is going to be giving us an oral history is Mr. Billy Barwald, as everybody calls him, but your real name is?
Mont.
Mont William Barwald. And we're really pleased to have him here, and he has a fascinating story to tell us, so we'll let you tell us.
All right, the reason I know that it's July the 19th, because yesterday was my birthday. I was 94 years old, and I have a clear memory of that. Susan Ford and Sandy Arpen have invited me to talk about Mandarin and Loretta from the past, and I'll be delighted to do so and make some explanations and tell you why I know about it and how I know about it and what I saw and what I believe, and I hope you'll be interested in the comments and thoughts that I will give you. I first came to Loretta, not to Mandarin, when I was about 10 years old, in 28, around that time. And the reason I came is rather peculiar. My father loved to hunt and fish, and he was a Georgia cracker, and in those days he liked to hunt quail. Florida was the premier cattle growing state in the nation. We grew the beef for the entire nation from the time of the Civil War up until in the 1950s. And because of that, Florida was mostly grassland. It was not like you see today. The ecology has changed dramatically, and instead of having all these heavily wooded areas, it was almost all open grassland with a few big pine trees that survived the fire. Now the reason for that was that cattle, one of their favorite foods, is a grass called wiregrass. It has a long scientific name, which I won't bother you with, but it has a unique facility which most, or a lot of wild grasses have. It has to be burnt off every year to reproduce itself. So in March each year in Florida, the whole state was set alight to burn off the grass to feed the cattle which supported the state. And as a result of that, you didn't see these heavily wooded areas that you see now. It was mostly open grasslands for miles and miles and miles. And the only wooded areas were in those swamps where it was too wet to burn. And that gave an entirely different concept to the situation. And the reason I came to Loretta when I was around 10 years old is in those days people hunted quail on horseback. They didn't walk because it was too far, and not only on horseback, you could sit up high and you could see your dogs and you could see where the birds flew, and it was a lot more comfortable. And there's another reason that people don't realize, and that is the cattle that roamed free in those days weren't like the nice plodding herds you see on television. These were wild beasts with huge big horns, and they would attack a man on foot just like a gorilla would practically, and you were very vulnerable if you were walking along with these wild cattle, because they were very vicious and very active and very mean, and they didn't like humans or anybody else near them. So people generally who hunted in those days did it on horseback. Now my father had no place in Jacksonville where we lived to keep a horse, so he somehow, I never really found out how, got in touch with a family named Bukowski that lives on now what is Greenland Road. there were three brothers, Gary, which was the oldest, Alvis, which was the next, and Eston, which was the youngest brother, and they lived on the side of the road towards where is now the high school, and from there on down up to about where the cross from the public school, the grammar school, is where their place was. There were three big stretches of land in there. And their business was to, as the expression goes in those days, run cattle. Now, they had a law in Florida that you weren't allowed to fence your own land. You could fence the land immediately around your homestead or around a garden plot or something like that, but if you owned 100 acres or 1,000 acres, you could not fence that land, and so the cattle roamed free. And this entire state, the ecology, economy, all depended on cattle. We were the #1 cattle producing state in the nation, and we were for many, many, many years, and I think, oddly enough, I think we're still #2, maybe #3. But the whole economy of this state was based on cattle, and they all roamed free out in this wide open spaces, and because they burnt the grass off each year, that killed all the young seedling trees that would normally reproduce. So in the open areas, you only saw some huge big pine trees that survived the fire, and the only other trees you saw were in the swamps where it was wet. And the other thing that Florida was noted for was timber, but the timber wasn't pine trees, the timber was cypress trees. And when I came back from World War II and went back to the agricultural school to learn horticulture and landscape architecture, the primary thing they taught was cattle culture and forestry, and horticulture was such a huge big item. There were 13 in my class, and so the whole emphasis, in fact the college was literally called the Cow College, and rightly so, because that's the primary thing they taught. And items like citrus culture wasn't even considered. It was only taught in relation to the horticultural class. It wasn't a separate course at all, even though citrus is now a huge industry in Florida. And cattle is still a big industry, but it's mostly unseen and further down the state than from here. My father needed to keep a horse or horses somewhere, and how he met the Bukowski family, I have no idea. But they were three brothers that lived on what is now Greenland Road. In those days it was just a dirt road that oddly enough ended down at Julington Creek. That was as far as it went. And at Julington Creek, which is a little bridge down on Greenland Road, there was a ford called Rudy Ford, and why it was called Rudy Ford, I have no idea. But it was interesting because the side that you came into from what is now Greenland Road was shallow, and you could walk or drive down there, but you couldn't get out on the other side because it was steep, so you had to drive along in the bottom of the creek for about 50 or 60 yards before it was a shallow place on the other side to get out. Now, when you were on horseback, it didn't bother a bit, or if you were waiting, it didn't bother, but if you were in an automobile, it was a different problem. Fortunately, the automobiles in those days were a little more vigorous and set much higher and were more able to ride down the creek bed, so to speak. And it was no reason to cross, particularly because the road ended there, but if you had some desperate reason to get across, that was how you had to do it. My father kept 2 or 3 horses, a mule, and a wagon, and the Bukowski family took care of them, and my father paid for it. most of the time when they hunted in either pairs or 3 or 4 together, and the mule and wagon followed with the extra dogs and the lunch and the beer or whatever they, of course, probably those days it wasn't beer, it was moonshine, but whatever they wanted to have on. And hunting was a lovely, leisurely experience out in the open, riding horseback, and you stopped in the middle of the day and put out a board on some sawhorses and had your lunch and drank iced tea or whatever, and it was more of a leisurely social experience, even though there was so many quail that it was just unbelievable. Quail are a walking bird that eats seed, and these open grasslands lends itself to the production of quail. In the modern era, because there's no open grassland, you practically never see quail, and the countryside has grown up in trees, so deer are extremely thick, and you can see them on the roads if you drive at night here, and turkeys. Turkeys and deer like heavy cover, and which we have today, but in those days turkey and deer were scarce, but quail were plentiful.
So is that what you were hunting, was quail then?
He was, yeah.
He was, yeah.
I was just 10 years old and was tagging along. I'll give you a good example of that. My father tells a story of how he had to go to Lake City one time, and he got away a little late, and it took him about 4 hours to get to McClenny. And he had a shotgun with him in the car, and every time he would see some quail fly across the road, he would shoot some quail. And when he stayed at the Annie Hotel in McClenny, which is still there today. I think the hotel's closed, but the building is still there, which was famous for their fried chicken dinners for many, many years. And when we were in high school, we kids used to get 4 or 5 carloads and go out and have fried chicken, all you could eat for $1.50, and we thought that was great. It was. But anyway, when he got there, he mentioned to the cook, he said, I got some quail out in the car, and you can have, serve for dinner at the hotel. And the next morning when he came down for breakfast, the cook came out and said, Mr. Ball, it was 110 quail in there, which he had killed just flying across the road between Jacksonville and McClenny, so you could see how plentiful they were. But anyway, fortunately, the McCoskey family that he kept the horses with was Alvis McCoskey, and he had 5 children. The 2 oldest were Carol and Leo McCoskey, and I came out with my cousin, and Carol and Leo and my cousin and I were exactly the same age. So we had 2 boys to play with while my father was off hunting. And you can't imagine the thrill of us city boys to go out into what was really the country in those days and spend the country and sleep on the floor in front of, on quilts in front of the stove at night and see cane grindings and, slaughterhouses and slaughtered animals. I might mention that the McCoskey family, because they, quote, ran cattle, meant that they had to slaughter them, and they had an abattoir. This is a word that's no longer in primary use today, but it means a slaughterhouse, not in the sense of what we would think of today, but what abattoirs were in those days, and everybody who, quote, ran cattle had one, was a concrete slab about 25 feet square with a tin roof on it. And it was always slightly tilted back towards a stream or a swamp or a creek, and you kept gators in there to clean up the whatever was left over from the cattle. and that was the disposal method. At the Bukowski place was a swamp there that wasn't truly a swamp, was a low place in the ground, and they let the water accumulate there. In fact, they might have dug it out a little bit, and it wasn't a natural habitat for gators, but they would catch them and have 3 or 4 or 5 footers in there to clean up what was left over from the cattle when they slaughtered them.
Oh my goodness.
And it was a very efficient method, I might add. Anyway, my cousin and I would come out whenever my parents would allow us to come for the weekend and stay with the Bukowski family, and they had all these children, and it was really an exciting time for us and thrilling experience. And one of our most thrilling experiences happened twice a year. Twice a year, they rounded up the cattle that they could catch with, this was all on horseback, using dogs and whips. Now the whips were not designed to whip the cattle, because if you touch the cattle with a whip, you cut the cattle, and there was a fly called a screwworm fly, which would get in the cut, and since these animals are so wild, you couldn't catch them, and the maggots that grew from those fly eggs would literally consume the animal himself unless you could run him down and treat it, which was, you know, like trying to catch a wild deer in the woods almost. And so they had cattle drives, just like you see in the West, twice a year, and they went out with the term, by the way, the term cracker came from them cracking their whips for noise. It wasn't meant to whip anything. And actually the dogs were the ones that rounded up the cattle for you, because they would bark and run around the cattle and scare them together, and they'd herd up all the cattle they could herd, even though whether they owned them themselves or not, and most of them, they really didn't care who owned them. They were just cattle roaming around, and we would have a cattle drive in the spring, and they would drive them down from Loretta down to Palm Valley. And the reason they put them in Palm Valley was there was palm trees that shaded them. It was a little bit cooler down there to spend the summer, and there was plenty of grass, so it was a little more, they felt like it was fattening the cattle better if they spent the summers in Palm Valley. And it's interesting, I was interested in that most of the land they drove through after they crossed what is now US 1 railroad tracks going to St. Augustine was Skinner property. And most of that land was owned by that particular bunch by Mr. Richard Skinner. And in later years, I was talking to Mr. Richard Skinner, doing some landscape work for him, and I mentioned this, and he said, oh yeah, I well remember every time the Bukowski family drove their cattle through my place, I lost about 100 herd that they gathered up my cattle with them and went on, and coming back and forth, I lost 100 each direction twice a year. Of course, in reality, it was kind of a joke, because there was so many of them running wild that were never caught that it didn't bother him a bit. It was just, in a way, I guess he was glad to get rid of them. But on these cattle drives, the men were on horseback with dogs, and we kids would get in the wagon with the bedrolls and the food, and you know, we were just extra help along. And the only time we were any use was when the first thing one of these cows would do when it get away would run down the swamps. Well, they couldn't get down there with the horses, so they would send us kids down there with the dogs to run the cattle out of the swamp. So we got all the dirty work, but it was such a thrilling experience for us two, my cousin and I, city boys, that we I always, to this day, have fond memories of this dirty, filthy, wild experience that
What an adventure.
kids don't get to do anymore.
Yeah, yeah.
But the change in Florida was that this wide open expanse of grass no longer exists. Well, it might exist in small patches down the state, but you can't believe the unbelievable changes this brought about when they brought about the thing about keep Florida green and they quit burning the place. It all grew up, and when it was
What year was that? Oh.
This was, I think, in 1950s or something.
Oh, in the 50s.
And I'm not sure of the exact date, but then the state had grown beyond this cattle producing business a little bit. But for example, I well remember in the 20s going down to Kissimmee, which is a big modern town today, and it was like the movie you see of the Wild West, dirt streets, hitching rails, horses tied to the rails, and you would have thought you'd gone back to the 1880s out in the Wild West, and here's the big, relatively, as we think of it today, a modern city. The Bukowski family was interesting because I'll tell you a little bit about them. Where they came from and how they got to Loretta, I have no idea, because most of the people who lived in Loretta in those days had relations with St. Augustine, and they were related to Menocan families who moved from St. Augustine and spread out from there, and we had the Lascos and the Hartleys and the Ponces and people like that. And with a name like Bukowski, obviously they were either Polish or Russian, and and physically they looked that appearance. They didn't have the dark look of most Menocan people. They had big round faces and kind of red hair with blue eyes, and they were obviously not of the same culture. And why and how they got to Loretta, which was pretty much in the sticks, I would say, I have no idea. But the three brothers, it was interesting during the Depression, or at least interesting to me, during the Depression, everything went broke, or everybody got broke. And the oldest brother, named Gary, got a job. He was starving to death in Loretta, and he got a job with a big landowner down in Fellsmere, Florida, which was another big cattle producing section, which still in those days did produce cattle. I mean, a man had 4,000 or 5,000 acres, and Gary Bukowski went down there with his daughter. His wife had died in the meantime, and got a job with this man and worked for him for about 20 years. And he was a valued employee. And sometime, I don't remember the exact date, but Florida built a toll road right through that area, and it went right through the piece of land that this man had given Mr. Bukowski. He had given him as a wedding present when he remarried 100 acres of his land, and the toll road went right through his middle of his property. And Mr. Gary Bukowski became an enormously wealthy man.
Oh.
After starving to death in Loretta. The other brother, you want to cut it off?
No, she's just saying,
We have 40 minutes
yeah,
left.
about 40 minutes we have left.
All right. The other brother, Eston, who left too, went down to Palm Valley and built a house on what is now called Michael's Landing Road. And it was called Michael's Landing because Mr. Uli Michael had his house on Michael's Landing Road, which was the only house. And his house was called 20 Mile because it was supposed to be 20 miles from St. Augustine and 20 miles from Jacksonville. And during Prohibition, which ended in, I think, 33 and all, they used to bring whiskey in across the beaches down at what is now Michael's Landing. And occasionally we kids would be allowed to go down there and help stack the whiskey up that came in over the beaches on from boats that anchored offshore, and stack them up in what is now called the Neck, and it's still down there called Neck Road, I believe. And the guano, it ends there, used to run on for another quarter of a mile, and they had taken and put corduroy logs down under this swamp and would drive across it with mules and wagons and not leave a trail and go across the sand dune down to the beach. And they were actually three-masted schooners that were obsolete, and they'd cut the mast off about 20 feet high to use as booms to pick these pallets up with the whiskey on it, and they were towed up there by tugs and anchored over the 3-mile limit. And then there was a man down in Mayport named Otto Hahn, who was one of the fishermen down there, and those fishermen all had boats called skipjacks, which were a heavy, sturdy built boat with a steel keel underneath it, so they could run it right up on the beach. And these skipjacks used to go out to the, I guess they called it a mothership or whatever, and load it on there and then bring it to the beaches. And a man named George O'Stryker was in charge of the thing. The story they told us kids was that this was all owned by the Capone family operation in Chicago. Well, who owned it, I don't know. We were just kids and we just thought it was great fun. Oddly enough, we never thought about it being illegal. It was just an exciting experience. And they used to bring it in on mule and wagon, and we'd stack it up under the trees, and then trucks would come down, I think from Chicago, and load it on and take it back to Chicago. And so it was, to us, an exciting, thrilling experience, even though it was illegal, and we didn't think. Eventually, we ended up moving out to Loretta by a peculiar, which I think is peculiar circumstance. And this is kind of an interesting story, I think. In 1926, they had a land boom in Florida. And the people from up north came to this paradise, or were going to buy land in this, quote, tropical paradise. And the whole state boomed, and with interest mostly from up north and places who knew nothing about the local situation. And you can see it today because it was a more Spanish influence, and all the developments were, and you see it in the names of San Marco, San Jose, that we have here in Jacksonville. And one of the funny stories to me was that where Bartram Park is now on Old St. Augustine Road, there was a development started in there where they cleared up the land and they put in curbings and they laid out the streets and they did all this thing, and they had a huge big sign made out of concrete blocks so it didn't rot away. And the sign, in the meantime, of course, it's all grown up in weeds and nothing there. And the sign said, what was the name of that place? La Vista, that was the name of this place. And underneath that was their slogan, the Chicago of the South.
Oh no.
And here we were, miles out in the woods. The closest actually civilization was Bayard, which they only had one building there, and that was the Wing family lived alongside the railroad track. and this was going to be the Chicago of the South. And believe it or not, there were literally hundreds of these abandoned developments all over the state of Florida.
Oh, yeah.
And I could go into that later about some of them. But anyway, in 1931, the land, in the 1926, a family, a trust in Chicago called the Fairbanks Trust bought several thousand acres, which is now Loretta. And they kept it until 1931, and then for reasons that I don't know anything about, they decided to sell it. And it was a huge, big tracts, and if you wanted to buy 100 acres, you bought 100 acres or 200 acres or however much you wanted, but it wasn't surveyed, and you had to have it surveyed and done, you know, picked out and all. And it was rather an expensive, time-consuming program if you weren't geared for that. But there was one tract of land that was not necessary done, and that was the 60 acres that my father bought. It was by chance on one side Loretta Road, and on the other side was a land grant thing, which goes back to 17-something, was clearly marked. And on the north side was another land grant, and then the other one was what is now Pine Acres Road. It was actually Hood Road in those days. It was called Hood Road because all those roads ended up at the Hood Cemetery down on Julian Creek.
Oh.
So all of these roads, which are now called Hartley Road, Aladdin Farms Road, Pine Acres Road, were all Hood Road because the Hood family used it to go to their cemetery down on Julian Creek. And the cemetery is still down there in case you're
I've seen it.
interested. And anyway, this one 60-acre tract was priced so outrageously that nobody wanted it. It was separately and all organized. Well, my father was looking for a place to build a log cabin out here for reasons that I really can't quite comprehend. I think he had visions of spending the night or something, I don't know. And he bought it for $15 an acre, which was such an outrageous price in the 30s that nobody could really believe it. But he said he didn't want 60 acres. What he wanted was one, but nobody sold that.
Oh my God.
So he ended up buying the whole piece because he had to buy it. And all the others were not surveyed. And Mr. Levin Arnold, who lived across the street from us later, across Rattle Road, bought, I don't know, 500 or 600 acres, but he was a engineer with the U.S. government, and he was a surveyor himself, and he was able to, over the years, survey his pieces and development and all that sort of thing. And for many, many years after that, he paid $7.50 an acre. And every time Mr. Levin Arnold saw my father, he always said, "I just can't believe you spent all that money." But another interesting, I think interesting, was my father had bought this land in 31 or 32, and he really wanted to build a log cabin, but he had nobody to chop down the logs and skin them off and build a log cabin, because there wasn't that many people out here, and he didn't know that many anyway, and so he never got around to it. Well, one time in one of these, later on in 33 or 4 or 5 or something, he was out hunting for the weekend, and he came in to Alvis McCoskey's place, and there was a black man sitting under a tree out in the yard. And my father said, "Who is that?" And Alvis McCoskey said, "Well, that's Rayford Hartley. He worked for me last week and he's waiting for his money." And so my father said, what do you mean? He said, well, he came here Friday and I didn't have $5 to pay him for his money, and he's waiting for his money, and I don't have $5 to pay him. So my father said, you mean to tell me he's been sitting there under that tree? He said, well, I couldn't help him. I let him go out and dig some sweet potatoes and cook some sweet potatoes for him, but that's all, you know, I didn't have anything else. And so my father says, it's terrible. And so he was going back to Jacksonville anyway. So he went to this man and said, get in the car, and he did. And he said, now I want to take you home. Where do you live? And so the man said, well, I'll show you. And he said, go down here. He ended up crossing what is now the St. Augustine Road, going down Loretta Road, on past the church, and he stopped in front of this piece of property, and he said, I live up there, and he pointed to this little trail through the woods. And my father said, well, you couldn't live there because that's my property, I own that property. And he said, how long did you live there? He said, well, I was born and raised there.
Oh my gosh.
And so we bought with the property a man
Oh my word.
spent 52 years working for us.
Oh.
And a wonderful man, wonderful man. And because we inherited him with the property, my father thought he was a wonderful man with an axe and a sling. So my father said, do you think you could build me a log cabin? And the man said, well, no, I don't know if I build log cabins, but I can cut down the logs for you. So my father said, somebody can run a crosscut saw. He said, yeah, I'll get my cousin to come with me. So my father said, all right, he got him a couple of axes, a crosscut saw, and a hoe, and he straightened the hoe handle where you could skin the trees off. And he showed him what he wanted. He said, I want you to cut, every time you get a chance, cut down nice big trees and saw them up, and he showed him the length that he wanted them, and skin them off and roll them up on this rack, and we'll let them cure here for about a year, and then we'll build a log cabin. And so Rayford Hartley and this other man, whoever he was, every day for like a year, cut down these fine trees and skin them off and roll them up off the ground where they'd air and dry. And in 1934 or 5, I'm not sure which, my father was directing and Rayford doing the work. They built a log cabin which I now use as my living room.
That's how that was a log cabin. Oh, interesting.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
Very. It's there is another log cabin in Mandarin.
Yeah, now that's interesting too, because when we moved our house out here in 1938, it was before the days of manufactured cabinets and things. And so we had to have all the shelves and cabinets and things done in the building by hand. And there was a man named Rohara, which is an old Minorcan family name, who lived out here, the Roharas, and he was a cabinet maker. And he had a man, Mr. Willie Munson, who lived down in Mandarin, was also a cabinet maker, and he built all the cabinets for the convent and all. And I know where several of them that he built back in the 1850s and 60s still are. I know 2 or 3 people that have some of them in their house here in Mandarin, or Loretta. And Mr. Rohara was fascinated with this log cabin concept. So when he finished building the cabinets for our house, he went down there and bought that piece of property and put that log cabin up because he'd seen the one my father had built, and he built one too. So that came along in, I don't know, after 1938 anyway, or 35, 6, or whenever.
Interesting. So really the log cabin was the first, that 60 acres stretched from up by Loretta School down to where you are
now. The 60 acres stretched from Pine Acres Road to
Pine Acres.
To our fenced by our
Where you are
property.
now?
Right,
Okay, and so the log cabin was the first structure that was
Right,
built?
right.
And then the house was moved from Riverside after that?
Oh, yeah, right.
A couple years
right,
after
right,
that?
Right.
Okay, interesting. I knew you lived in a log cabin, but that's a fascinating story about it.
Well, when my wife and I got married in 1947, we didn't have any money. And my father had given me 10 acres of property as a wedding present. And the only thing on the 10 acres was the log cabin. Now, my wife was from England, and as you can imagine, she'd probably never seen dirt in her life. And here I was moving her out to the boondocks, which it was in those days. And I was very concerned, so I told her, I said, well, we'll just take this on temporarily.
Yeah.
And when we get enough money, we will build a proper home here. We won't put up with this log cabin. But after we had lived in it for 30 or 40 or 50 years, it became kind of permanent, and it's still there. And so,
It's charming, really. It's a
yeah,
beautiful
yeah.
place. Yeah.
It's part of the past, so to speak, like I am.
Yeah. Wow.
Aren't we all?
Okay. Okay, well, there was something I was going to ask you. Oh, just out of curiosity, going back to when you went out to the Bukarskis with your cousin, and you said you'd play out there, and it sounded like y'all did a lot of work too, or you kind of helped them out. But
Well,
did
we
y'all
were
play
10,
too? I mean, what kind of
12,
stuff
you know,
did you
12
play?
or 14.
did you
Everybody
do?
had chores to do, you
Yeah.
know what I mean? Milk the cow and feed the cow and clean the stalls and do whatever, or pick the vegetables or whatever. And
interesting,
it
yeah.
wasn't, kids didn't sit around and play games, you know what I mean? Everybody had work to do, and everybody had chores to do, and it was part of being in a family. And so my cousin and I were glad to help because it was entirely different than our experience in Jacksonville. And to tell you the truth, it was almost like if you'd picked me up and taken me to the moon. It was such a different environment and different culture and different interest, and everything was entirely different, but it was a really exciting time for us.
And you knew you wanted to come back there after?
No,
service?
I had no dreams of coming
Coming
back
back?
after anything. In fact, I was in the war so long and I was so active that I never dreamed that I would survive. I mean, it never even occurred to me that I would survive the war. And when I came back from the service, I sat for about 2 months just sitting there thinking, what in the world am I going to do? I hadn't had any plans for the future. I had no concept of anything. And God looked after me, and He directed me back to school into the field of horticulture and landscape architecture, which has been a thrill and exciting experience. And I am 94 and I still enjoy it, and I'm still part of it, and I just couldn't imagine anything else. But that was just sheer luck. I mean, it had nothing to do with deep thoughts or anything else.
And we're going to talk about your experiences in the war and all, however much you want to next time.
I don't mind.
Next time, yeah. Okay, so I guess now
We've got 15
our
minutes.
plan was to kind of talk up to about the time.
Right,
so
right.
we're kind of at that point.
I think so.
Okay.
I think so. We can refer back to
Well,
it if you want
yeah,
to.
well, I had one other thing about prior to 36 too, because you were living in Riverside,
Right.
Mhm.
and do you have brothers and sisters or no?
Oh, yeah.
You do. Okay. Are they older, younger?
I had a half brother and a half sister from my mother's first marriage,
Okay.
and a sister from the Barwald.
Who's younger than
right,
you?
yeah,
Younger than
right.
you.
She lives at the beach.
Okay. All right. And she's still living as well?
Oh yeah, I was had
Oh.
lunch with her yesterday.
Oh, that's awesome. Okay. And then you graduated from high school, what, at Lee?
Yeah.
Lee, okay.
I went to West Riverside, John, Gorey, and Lee.
And Lee, all right. And then by the time your father and mother decided to move the house out here, which we'll talk about next time, you were gone.
No, my father and mother didn't. My father did.
Oh, your father.
My mother,
Your mother
was dragged along.
She was dragged along.
Those ridges in the road of my mother's heels as they dragged her out here, because she learned to really like it, but it was a horrible wrench for her, and it was a terrible experience for my sister.
Oh.
And she has never recovered from it.
How old was your sister?
12.
12, okay.
And it's a terrible time for a young woman living in Riverside at 12 years old with all her friends and all to be dragged out here to the country.
Yeah.
And I might add, as interest, this is kind of an interesting story, that when they moved out here in 1938, the public school was being built.
Okay.
Hadn't been built,
Yeah.
but it was
Right
being.
across the street.
Right. And the school at that time was, the public school was down at the convent, which was a little wooden building, and they had outhouses.
Yep.
And my sister takes great pains to tell her children, said, well, if you think you had it bad, when I went to school, we didn't even have flush toilets.
That's true.
Which was a thing of horror to her coming from Jacksonville, but now it's a very proud moment that she grew up with, you know.
Yeah. Well, that's where we'll pick up then. Next time we'll pick up around that time.
But I don't mind. I'll do whatever you want to do, and I think, you know, that these things would be of interest to people who can't understand the concept of the ecology change in Florida.
Yeah.
I mean, it was so enormous that it actually has almost no relationship to what you see when you drive down the road today and you see these thick woods and all this sort of thing.
Yeah.
And it was just grass for miles,
Yeah.
you know what I mean?
Or even over on this side, with the orange groves, you needed a lot of sun. So, I mean, certainly there were the big oaks, but there was definitely more open area. This property we're on was much more open because of the orange groves, which I know we're going to get into the citrus industry more. Yeah. But this will be, okay, this will be a good...
By the way, when did y'all move out?
Tracy's dad moved his dairy farm from Springfield in 1923.
Out to here?
Out to the blue house next to us, the two-story blue house. And then he died not long after that. So she was
He
alone.
didn't have a dairy there.
He very briefly, but then he died, and when Agnes was by herself, she sold off all the dairy and she rented her rooms out for boarders.
I knew that,
Kind of how she survived. Because he didn't live much after they moved out here. But they moved the dairy, moved the cows, walked them, herded them down State Road 13, crossed the Acosta Bridge, I think, and out 13.
Yeah, that's like the Denise family had the dairy up on the south side.
Yeah.
And when they did what is now Hendricks Avenue, they went right through their dairy.
Yeah.
And they had to move.
Well, the Arpens originally had property right on DuPont Avenue. That's where Tracy's dad was born, in the home on DuPont Avenue. And they had a dairy there, and then they were in Springfield. And he had a dairy truck, a wagon, you know, said Arpen Dairy. And
are you doing one of these things?
We're going to do it. The Arpen family.
I mean, you were here before we were here.
Well,
what are you talking about?
Karen talked to Tracy Sr. At some point. She did talk to him, yeah. And
because when we moved out here, y'all and Fleming Bowden were the only two houses on the road.
Is that right? Yeah, probably so.
Right.
Yeah.
And then Elizabeth and Levering came the year or two after that, and that was it.
That's right. Well, Tracy's dad talks about going to school down at the convent, you know. Oh. And then when, I guess he eventually must have gone up there, 1938, must have, gone to school there, maybe, talking about
well, that's where the public school was. was not the Catholic school, but the
Yeah.
public school was right across the
Yeah.
street from where the old church is now.
Uh-huh.
There's a little wooden building in there, and that's where the quote public school
Well,
was.
he talked about carrying buckets of water, going down and getting water to bring it up past your place. Like, can you imagine?
5 minutes left.
Yeah, we're done. We're just